Marin Katusa's new book, The Colder War, is now on bookshelves. Marin pulls away the curtain on how Russia, China, and Iran have come to dominate the global energy stage and put the petrodollar to rest once and for all. Find out why Dr. Ron Paul and critics alike are calling The Colder War one of the most important books you will read this year. Visit PalisadeRadio.com and enter our weekly drawing to win a free signed copy of Marin's book. That's PalisadeRadio.com.
Hey everyone, this is Colin Cattell with Palisade Radio. Just a quick reminder that we're giving away free signed copies of Marin Katusa's new book, The Colder War. This week the book has already become a New York Times bestseller, and I'd like to announce our very first book giveaway, and it's going to Thomas from Calgary, Alberta. Congratulations to Thomas, and I hope you enjoy the book. There are still 7 more copies of the book to be given away, one each week until the beginning of January. Just go to PalisadeRadio.com, sign up with your name and email to enter to win. Now on to our interview for the week, and this is going to be a good one. This week we welcome on John Wiliams. John is the founder and publisher of ShadowStats.com, the only reliable source for the real government statistics. John, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we get into the nitty-gritty and dissect the government's lies and deceit, can you tell our audience a little bit about how you got so interested in government statistics and how that evolved into ShadowStats.com?
Sure. I've been a private consulting economist for more than 30 years, and I found early on that if I wanted to have any hope of making meaningful forecasts, that I really had to fully understand what was happening with the numbers. One of my early clients was a large manufacturer of commercial aircraft, and they had a model that explained reasonably well revenue passenger miles, which is one of their major forecasting tools, and is based on the government's gross domestic product. All of a sudden, it wasn't working. They asked me about it. I looked at it, and I realized that there were problems in the GDP numbers. Actually, it was called the BNP in those days. Tied to the trade numbers, I corrected the numbers and things worked. And then, unfortunately, as time evolved, I found that the series kept moving further and further away from what seemed to be the real world and common experience. What happened? I find if I talk with most people today, they'll think that the inflation's higher than it is reported by the government, that unemployment's higher, and that the economy's weaker. The sense of the public is very good here. What's happened over time is that the politicians in Washington have allowed changes to the methodologies in calculating the key series, and the changes generally have been aimed at building in upside biases to the economic statistics, downside biases to the to the inflation, and enough so that I looked to estimate how big that difference was, and I started with the inflation numbers and looked at the changes that had been made over time, and I came up with an alternate measure on the CPI based on the way the CPI used to be calculated. The difference is really quite significant, and for the average person, I find that inflation is really one of the most heavily used concepts, important from an investment standpoint, from a standpoint of how your salary goes. And normally when people look at having their salary adjusted or setting a target for their investment return, they'd like to beat inflation. And if you're using too low an inflation rate, which is what you're getting from the government now, there's no way that you're going to do that if you're relying upon the government's estimate.
So John, just to give our audience an idea of how different your numbers are from the government numbers, say the first half of 2014, what was the government reporting versus Shadow Stats?
In terms of inflation, as of, say, mid-year, you're basically at 2% year-over-year consumer price index inflation. Difference is that Shadow Stats would have that up around 9.7% year-over-year. That's the differential that has been affected by all these changes in methodology. When they there's been a lot of changes that have been made, and each time that a change has been made, the Bureau of Labor Statistics talks about it. They're open about what they do. They also estimate its impact, that it'll reduce the annual inflation rate by 0.3% or whatever that particular move does. What I've done is I've taken what they've estimated the impact of their changes are and added that back into the official reporting. And if you look at my site, right-hand column, there's a free article of their public comment on inflation that details what has happened there and how those numbers have worked out. But based on the changes in methodology since 1980, you're a little over 7 percentage points higher than what the government's reporting. And if you base it on the changes since 1990, which is more of the Greenspan era, then you're looking at something closer to 3.4% higher.
So my next question is, and I think you've kind of already answered this, is the government lying? I mean, are they actually going out of their way to lie, or do they simply calculate things differently than you do? I mean, for example, the last time I checked, Keynesians and Austrians can't even agree on a definition for inflation, and I think you lie more on the side of the increase in money supply is inflation, whereas the Keynesians can say, well, actually, there's more money, but the prices didn't go up because you can substitute it for something better at a lower price. So do their numbers stink, or are they actually being facetious?
Well, it depends. Depends on what you're using the number for. The way most people view inflation, the way it's been used historically, the way an investor would look at it is where the inflation number actually has value. How much should my income go up by this next year in order to stay ahead of inflation? What kind of a return do I need to get on my investments to stay ahead of inflation? What you're looking at there is, by definition, a concept of what's needed to maintain a constant standard of living. That's your measure of inflation. How much is my cost of living maintaining a constant standard going? How much is it going up, or how much is it going to go up? And that's the way the inflation, as the common guy looks at it, was measured way back in time. The concept of this substitution base may be fine when you get into areas of trying to estimate an inflation-adjusted gross domestic product, but it's an entirely different definition of inflation. What the government's doing is they're trying to use this substitution-based definition. They're trying to find the lowest approach of calculating inflation. I mean, the approach will give them the lowest inflation rate that they can justify, but it's not usable to the average person. The number they come up with is designed very specifically, and Greenspan said this, Muskin said this, designed very specifically to reduce the cost of living measure that was being used to adjust Social Security. Had they not made the changes that they did, the average Social Security recipient would be receiving Social Security checks double the size that they are now. It was successful. They changed the system. They were very open about why they were doing this. They were doing this to reduce the Social Security payments, and it was a matter of how they defined it. And in terms of are they lying? Of course they are. If they're trying to sell this as a concept of this is what you need to live on, they would have done much better just to be straightforward and say, "Hey guys, we can't afford to increase payments here as we thought we could. We got to cut back." Nobody in Washington wants to talk about cutting back on the social programs, but they're not being honest with the American people in terms of what the inflation measure reflects. It is not an honest number in terms of what you need as an individual to adjust your income or your investments. They pushed the collapse of what was shaping up then in 2008 into the future. Did they use the interim time to resolve the banking system issues, to bring the economy into basic balance? No. The economy still is falling. big reason it's continuing to fall. The big reason it never recovered was that the consumer generally is in at tight financial straits. Income is not growing faster than inflation, and when you're not growing fast, when your income is not growing faster than inflation, you may be tempted to make up the difference and to maintain your constant standard of living or improve it by borrowing. But the debt collapse in 2008 eliminated a lot of the options there. So basically, the consumer's been strapped for liquidity, hasn't been able to do an economic rebound here, and until trade policies, all sorts of things are changed, start to generate real income growth for the average guy, you're not going to have an economic turnaround. That's always off. But the banking system remains in trouble. If the banking system were fully solvent and in good shape, you'd have normal lending in the markets. That would help to stimulate the economy. You're not seeing that. All they did in the crisis of 2008 was push it into the future. And everything that did there had inflationary impact in the long term. And now we're coming up to the day of reckoning. They kicked the can down the road. The can's there in the road ahead of us, and I don't see them being able to kick it the way they did in the past. We're coming up on one of the great financial crises of all times. This has pulled in the hyperinflation fear from the end of the decade into the current time frame. And from the standpoint of the global markets, and this is where you'll see the play, the rest of the world really doesn't want to hold the dollar. I mean, right now you're seeing dollar strength, and one explanation you'll get is, the rest of the world's falling apart and they're seeking safety in the dollar. That's nonsense. We're fudging our numbers more than the rest of the world. The weakness that you see in the global economy, we also have. We're just playing games with the Fed right now and trying to keep the markets up. And there's nothing fundamental there to support things. It will give way. And when it does, you're going to have a massive decline in the value of the dollar. That in turn becomes very inflationary. Oil prices spike despite all the sharp drop you've seen in oil and gas. That's going to go right back up there and continue as people begin to flee the dollar. And when you have a mass decline in the dollar, panic decline in the dollar, which I think we're going to see in the not too distant future here, the effects will be very much to create a big inflation domestically, and will provide the proximal trigger for that hyperinflation that I'm looking for. As the rest of the world moves to dump the dollar, the average American will increasingly shun it as well, and try and get his or her assets elsewhere. The hedge here is particularly precious metals. I know gold and silver have been pummeled, and that's been a deliberate effort by the central banks. They know what's going on here. They have no way out. If they had a way out, they'd be pursuing it, but they're just trying to buy time. They're just trying to kick the can down the road a little more. And I'm saying we're basically they don't have much more they can do here.
Do your numbers on the potential hyperinflation give you any targets for the price of gold, or is it a total unknown?
Gold and inflation, and this is just something to keep in mind. It is, you're not really making money. I could gold $100,000 an ounce, $1 million an ounce, depending upon how the currency crisis goes and what point they decide to shut down the dollar and do something else. $100 million an ounce, but that's not. If you see gold at $100,000 an ounce, and you bought it at $1,500 an ounce or $2,000 an ounce, or you haven't made any money. What you've done is you've preserved the purchasing power of the assets that you put into that gold. It's a store of wealth. I'm talking physical gold here. I wouldn't trust anything that's paper. But it would basically, in the type of crisis that you have ahead, you need to be able to preserve your wealth and assets and liquidity. The precious metals generally do that for you. They enable you to ride through an extremely difficult time and come out at the other end with effectively your assets intact, liquid, and able to take advantage of whatever unfolds at the other side of the crisis.
True point. I guess my final question here would be, you've been on national television, you've testified before Congress. Have you ever run into one of the big guys like Bernanke or Greenspan or Janet Yellen, and have they ever pulled you aside and said, look, John, we know our numbers are rubbish, but lying to the American people works. Could you stop being such a downer all the time and telling the truth?
No, I've not had direct conversations like that. I get enough feedback from same very closely related entities. The problem for the Fed, the problem for the federal government is that they have no way to address the problem. They let things get too far out of control over the years. And you had a day of reckoning in 2008, and they bought their way out of that, but at an extraordinary cost, which is going to make, kicking the can down the road again extremely difficult. If you had someone of courage in the government, running the government. By courage, I'm talking about someone who's willing to the American people say, hey, look, long term here, we're insolvent. We can't possibly meet the obligations we've agreed to take on. The rest of the world recognizes that. You go back to I guess it was August of 2009 when Standard & Poor's downgraded the U.S. Treasuries. You saw a dollar panic at that time because the rest of the world knew long term the dollar's worthless the way we're set, unless we could bring our house into fiscal order. There were a lot of intervention, machinations. We're still going through stuff like that. What you need is to have someone at the federal government level saying, look, here's the issues. We've got to bring our fiscal house into order, which also means with the programs such as Social Security, Medicare, healthcare plans, that these programs have to be made fiscally solvent. Those things can be done. The problem is it requires some sacrifice on the part of a number of people, the American people in general, to get the system back into balance. But if you could do that, then you could have real confidence in the dollar from outside, rather than this manufactured stuff that we're seeing right now, with the Fed playing games about, we're being virtuous, we're stopping our quantitative easing as the rest of the world expands a quantitative easing. But now that the election's passed and the economy's slowing down, the talk of quantitative easing here is going to come back pretty quickly. And again, that'll be one of the factors hitting the dollar along with the weakness in the economy. Weak economy here again would be very, very bad news. So the fiscal end could have been addressed. The longer you go, the more painful it is. It's going to have to be addressed at some point as the system becomes unmanageable. From most people's standpoint, though, the big concern will be the economy. And in order to get the economy growing, you have to reverse a couple of decades of very bad policies in Washington, which I don't see happening.
Well, John, thanks so much on that point. I encourage all of our listeners to go to shadowstats.com. They can get all the true figures and sign up for the premium service to get your premium in-depth analysis of the government statistic numbers. John, thanks so much for joining us today.
You're most welcome. Thanks again.
Vladimir Putin is a self-made man. He did not come from money. He did not come from a royal family. He was your blue-collar boy who did well. Putin has positioned himself in the center of the chessboard in the energy matrix of the world. Right now, Putin and his allies in China, India, Brazil, all of the emerging markets are aligning together to fight the European Union, the IMF, and America. Eventually, the rest of the world will realize that Obama and America are hiding behind this curtain with no powers anymore. Putin specifically, has positioned Russia to become a global superpower, and America has never been more vulnerable than it is today.